What happens when a man who believes love is a liability hires a woman whose heart was made to heal? Ethan Ward, a powerful CEO who built his life on rules and control, never planned to feel anything again. After tragedy turned him cold, he created a contract: 1 year, one marriage, one heir, nothing more. But when Grace Miller, a once compassionate nurse drowning in debt and loss, walks into his office, something shifts. She signs the deal to save her family, never imagining that it will be her own heart she'll risk losing. Two strangers bound by paper, living in a penthouse high above the city where silence says more than words, and where control begins to crumble under the weight of emotion. What happens when the lines blur, when duty turns to desire, and when the man who swore he'd never love again discovers he can't let her go? This isn't just a story about a contract. It's about the courage to feel, the cost of redemption, and the freedom found in love. If you believe love can change even the coldest hearts, hit like, share, and subscribe to join us for He Hired Her for 1 year until love rewrote the contract. What happens when a man who treats love as a liability hires a woman whose heart was built to heal? The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days. It painted the windows of downtown Seattle in endless streaks of gray, turning the skyline into a watercolor of glass and steel. Inside Ward Technologies' tower, everything was precise, gleaming, and silent. Not even the storm outside dared to disturb Ethan Ward's office. He stood by the window, hands in his pockets, eyes fixed on the city below. Ethan was a man who measured life in numbers, profits, percentages, deadlines. Emotion was noise, and he had long since learned to live without it. The elevator chimed. He didn't turn around when the doors opened. Grace Miller stepped out, clutching her worn leather purse. She had chosen her neatest outfit, an ivory blouse and an old gray skirt that had seen better days. The receptionist had told her, "Mr. Ward doesn't like lateness." So she had arrived 10 minutes early and still felt late. "Mr. Ward will see you now," the assistant had said. Now she was here, standing in front of the man whose name was whispered across every business channel in Washington state. Ethan Ward, tech visionary, millionaire at 42, and, apparently, a man in need of a wife, Miss Miller. His voice was deep, clipped, carrying no warmth. Grace nodded. "Mr. Ward." He gestured toward the chair across from his desk. "Please, sit." She did. The chair was Italian leather, soft as butter. Everything in this office spoke of precision, the sharp angles of the furniture, the soft hum of air conditioning, even the faint scent of cedar and coffee that clung to the air. Ethan took his seat behind the desk. For a moment, neither spoke. Grace tried to read his face, but his expression was unreadable, a man carved from discipline. Finally, he slid a document across the polished surface. "This is the agreement." Grace's fingers trembled as she reached for it. The title at the top read, "Confidential Marital Contract." Her throat tightened. "So it's real." "It's very real," he replied. "A legal marriage, 1 year only. The purpose is simple." He paused, as if calculating how to make something intimate sound purely mechanical. "An heir." Grace stared at the words. 1 year, an heir. It sounded clinical, heartless. "I don't understand," she whispered. Why do you need this?" Ethan leaned back, eyes narrowing slightly. "My father is retiring in 14 months. He insists that the company must remain a family legacy. If I have no heir by then, control of Ward Technologies reverts to the board. I prefer to keep it private." "You could adopt," she said softly. His jaw tightened. "That's not acceptable to him." The silence stretched. Grace's mind spun. Her mother's hospital bills had reached $60,000. The debt collectors had stopped calling and started sending letters instead. She had tried everything: extra shifts, side jobs, but it was never enough. How much, she asked quietly. He didn't flinch. $500,000, paid in full at the end of the contract. Her chest tightened. $500,000. enough to pay the bills, fix the house, and maybe breathe again. But the cost wasn't just time, it was dignity. What exactly would you expect from me? Ethan's gaze held hers, calm and detached. You would live here, in my penthouse. Appear with me at select public events. Follow medical instructions provided by my physician. Discretion is mandatory. After the child is born, the marriage will be dissolved. You'll retain no legal or financial claim, other than the agreed payment. He said it as if reciting a weather report. Grace tried to steady her voice. And if I change my mind, you won't. Something inside her snapped at the certainty in his tone. You sound awfully sure of yourself. Ethan's lips curved in something that might have been a smile, or maybe just the shadow of one. I've read your file, Miss Miller. You need this, and you don't strike me as someone who creates unnecessary trouble. Her cheeks burned. You mean someone desperate? He didn't answer. The silence was the answer. Grace's eyes dropped to the paper. Her reflection wavered on its glossy surface. Tired eyes, smudged lipstick, a woman cornered by circumstance. She turned the page. Clause 3.1. Parties agree to enter a legal marital arrangement for a period of 12 months. Clause 5.4. Party B relinquishes all parental rights following birth of the child. Her stomach turned. The legal language felt like chains tightening around her wrists. Outside, thunder rolled across the bay. Ethan tapped the desk lightly. If you prefer, you may have an attorney review it, but time is limited. Grace looked up, her voice trembling. Why me, out of all the women you could have chosen? He paused, studying her. His eyes were pale gray cool, analytical, but not cruel. Because you're practical, because you don't play games, and because you understand what loss feels like. That makes you predictable. The words stung more than she expected. Grace rose from the chair, heart pounding. Mr. Ward, this is wrong. You're talking about a child like it's an investment. Ethan stood too, tall and imposing. Everything I've built came from control, not emotion. I don't plan to change that now. She wanted to shout at him, to tell him love wasn't something you could buy, but the words caught in her throat. He reached for a silver pen and placed it on the document. You have until Friday to decide. Grace stared at the pen. It gleamed under the office light like a blade. My driver will take you home, he said, his tone final. But she didn't move. Her mother's tired face flashed in her mind, the oxygen tank, the late-night coughing, the unpaid bills stacked on the counter. What if, her voice broke, what if I say yes? Ethan looked at her then, really looked. Something flickered in his eyes, a hint of doubt, or maybe curiosity. Then your life changes. Instantly, she swallowed hard. And yours? He hesitated. Just a heartbeat. Mine stays exactly the same. She almost believed him. The rain outside had softened into a steady rhythm. Grace took the pen. Her hand shook as she signed her name at the bottom of the page. Ethan watched silently, arms crossed. When she finished, he reached for the contract, scanning her signature with the same precision he used for quarterly reports. Welcome to the arrangement, he said quietly. Then, as she turned to leave, he added, almost as an afterthought, don't fall in love with me. Grace froze in the doorway. She didn't look back when she answered. Don't worry, Mr. Ward. I can't afford to. Outside, the rain started again harder this time, as if the city itself knew she had just sold a year of her soul. Seattle's skyline stretched beneath a silver sky, the kind that never promised sunlight. The rain had returned, steady and thin, tracing delicate rivers down the glass elevator that carried Grace Miller 48 floors above the city. Her reflection in the glass looked ghost-like pale skin, tired eyes, a woman trying to convince herself she was doing the right thing. When the elevator doors opened, a quiet beep announced her arrival. The hallway was carpeted in soft gray. the air perfumed with something expensive and faintly masculine. At the end of the corridor stood a tall man in a black suit. Mrs. Ward, he said with a polite nod, though the title felt strange to both of them. I'm Thomas, Mr. Ward's house manager. Let me show you around. Mrs. Ward. The words echoed hollowly in her mind. She had never imagined hearing them addressed to her, not like this. The penthouse door slid open with a discreet click. Grace stepped inside, and for a moment, she couldn't breathe. It was beautiful, coldly, perfectly beautiful. The space was vast and open, every surface polished, every line symmetrical. White marble floors met walls of glass that looked out across the city. The furniture was minimalist gray, black, silver like a photograph drained of color. A faint scent of cedar and citrus lingered in the air, subtle but distinctly Ethan. This is the main living area, Thomas said, his voice low, efficient. Kitchen, lounge, dining room. Your quarters are through the left corridor. Grace followed him silently, her shoes making no sound on the marble. She passed an unused piano near the window, black, glossy, untouched. A single glass of water sat on the counter, condensation beating down its side, as if someone had been there moments before. Ethan's presence filled the space without him being there. His precision, his control. Even the air seemed to move according to his rhythm. Thomas stopped by a sleek panel on the wall and tapped the screen. It came alive with a soft chime. This controls the apartment's schedule, he explained. Lighting, meals, security, temperature, breakfast at 7:00 a.m., exercise at 8:30, doctor's appointments as arranged by Mr. Ward. All information will appear here daily. Grace stared at the digital interface, her new life reduced to a set of programmed commands. Does he really plan everything like this? She asked quietly. Thomas hesitated. Mr. Ward values structure. Grace smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. Structure? She repeated, as if tasting the word. It felt more like confinement. He gestured toward a set of double doors. Your room. The bedroom was enormous, larger than her entire apartment had been. The bed, dressed in crisp white linens, faced a wall of windows overlooking Elliott Bay. Beyond it, the city glimmered beneath the rain like scattered silver. There's a wardrobe with new clothing, Thomas continued. All your sizes were provided in advance. Meals are prepared by the kitchen staff. If you need anything, use the intercom. Grace nodded, though her throat felt tight. Thank you. He gave a polite bow of his head. Mr. Ward asked me to remind you of your medical appointment tomorrow at 10. Of course. When the door closed behind him, silence filled the room, heavy and absolute. Grace sank onto the edge of the bed, running her fingers over the sheets. They were soft, but cool. Everything here was soft, cool, and impersonal, like the inside of a luxury hotel that never expected guests to stay long enough to leave a mark. She unpacked her suitcase slowly. It took less than 10 minutes. A few dresses, a stack of folded shirts, her mother's old sweater, a framed photograph. She placed the photo on the bedside table, her mother smiling weakly from a hospital bed. Holding Grace's hand, the image felt out of place here, a piece of warmth in a room that didn't understand it. As the hours passed, Grace wandered through the penthouse. The kitchen gleamed with stainless steel appliances she didn't know how to use. The living room held books arranged by color, not subject. There were no photographs, no personal touches, not a single thing that suggested someone lived here. Only small traces of him, a black tie draped over the back of a chair, a half-empty bottle of scotch by the window, a watch left on the piano lid. She found herself standing by the window where the rain hit hardest. From here, the city looked endless roads twisting like veins of light, tiny cars moving through the fog. She imagined people down there, laughing, arguing, living freely. And here she was, in a cage made of glass and silence. Her phone buzzed, A text from Ethan. Medical review confirmed for tomorrow. Thomas will drive you. Dinner at 6 if you wish to join. If you wish to join. The phrasing felt almost kind, though she knew it wasn't meant that way. Still, she stared at the message longer than she needed to. Grace placed her phone down, walked to the untouched piano, and pressed one key. The note echoed softly through the room, lonely, lingering, and then gone. She sat at the bench for a moment, fingertips resting on the cool ivory keys. She hadn't played in years, not since her mother's health began to fail. Music had once been her solace, her quiet rebellion against the world's hardness. But here, even sound felt like intrusion. As evening fell, city lights began to flicker on below. The penthouse glowed in warm tones, now dimmed lamps, amber reflections on glass. Grace changed into the pale blue silk nightgown that had been left for her in the wardrobe. She didn't know who had chosen it, but somehow she suspected Ethan had. It was tasteful, expensive, and utterly impersonal, like everything else. Dinner arrived precisely at 6. A tray of roasted salmon, wild rice, and lemon water. Thomas didn't speak as he placed it on the table. When she thanked him, he merely nodded and left. She ate in silence, her fork clinking softly against the porcelain. Every sound echoed, every breath seemed too loud. When she finished, she turned off the lights and walked back to the window. The rain had thinned into mist, blurring the city into shades of silver and blue. Somewhere below, people were returning home to families, to laughter, to warmth. Grace pressed her palm to the cold glass. She thought about Ethan, the man who had built all of this and yet seemed to live in none of it. A man who had offered her $500,000 in exchange for a year of her life. And she had said yes. The truth hit her with sudden clarity. She wasn't a wife. She wasn't even a partner. She was part of a plan. Her reflection in the window stared back pale, small, uncertain. She whispered into the silence, her voice trembling just above the hum of the city. I've sold a year of my life. I just hope I still recognize myself at the end. Outside, the wind sighed against the glass as if answering her, and somewhere, faintly. The piano key she'd pressed earlier still seemed to echo one fragile note suspended in an ocean of silence. The days began to blend together, smooth and silent, like pages of a book written in invisible ink. Each morning, Grace woke to the soft hum of the automated blinds opening at precisely 7. The sky was always gray, the rain sometimes a whisper, sometimes a storm. Seattle seemed to exist in shades of melancholy, a perfect mirror of her new life. Breakfast appeared on the kitchen counter without conversation. A soft chime would sound. And there it was, oatmeal with berries, black coffee, sometimes poached eggs. Someone prepared it, but she never saw them. The apartment worked like clockwork meals, reminders, routines, all unfolding without human touch. Grace followed the schedule because it gave her something to hold on to. She took her vitamins at 8:30, walked in the rooftop garden at 10, read for hours in the sunroom when the clouds thinned enough to let the light through. The library had hundreds of books, all arranged by spine color, pale gray, ivory, muted blue, as if someone had tried to organize emotion into order. At first, she thought she would get used to it, the quiet, the distance, but it wasn't silence that hurt. It was absence. Ethan Ward was rarely home. When he was, he existed like a ghost made of restraint. She would hear him late at night, the faint click of the elevator, his shoes on marble, a drawer sliding shut. In the mornings, the smell of coffee would linger, proof he had been there. Sometimes, she found notes on the kitchen island. Appointment rescheduled, 30p Impcs. Dinner with investors tonight. Don't wait up. Take care of yourself. That last one had been written once. Only once. Grace told herself she didn't care. She told herself this was easier. No expectations, no emotional entanglements. But the truth was lonelier. She journaled at night, small entries written in the tidy script of a woman trying to stay whole. Day 12. The sound of rain is the only thing that feels real. Day 18. I should feel safe, but I feel invisible. Day 23. He's not cruel. He's just absent, like someone who left a light on and forgot to come home. One afternoon, she tried cooking, the staff wasn't there, and the kitchen felt like forbidden territory. She searched for ingredients, clumsily chopping onions and burning garlic. The smell filled the sterile air, and for the first time, the penthouse smelled like a home imperfect, alive. When Ethan walked in that night, she nearly dropped the ladle. He looked startled, as though he'd entered the wrong apartment. His tie was loosened, his expression unreadable. "I didn't realize you cooked," he said finally. Grace shrugged, awkwardly wiping her hands on a towel. "I don't really, but I was tired of food that looked like it was designed by a computer." A flicker of amusement crossed his face, fleeting, but real. "You don't like precision. I like warmth," she said, meeting his gaze. Something in his eyes shifted, as though the word itself unsettled him. He sat down across from her, silent while she served the simple meal. Roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, salad, too plain for a man who probably dined at Michelin-starred restaurants, but he ate it without complaint. For a few minutes, they were just two people sharing a meal, no contracts, no expectations, just the quiet clinking of forks and the occasional whisper of rain. Then his phone buzzed. He looked down, frowned, and stood. "Excuse me." And just like that, the fragile moment broke. After he left, Grace cleaned the dishes alone. She didn't cry. She didn't even sigh. She simply wiped the table, turned off the lights, and whispered to herself, "You knew what this was." But knowing didn't make it hurt less. Across the city, Ethan Ward sat in the back of his car, watching the rain fall against the tinted windows. His reflection stared back, sharp jaw, tailored suit, perfect composure. But behind his calm exterior, his thoughts churned. Control is peace. Feelings are chaos. He repeated it like a prayer. It had been his mantra for years, through mergers, through his father's scorn, through every broken attempt at connection. Emotion was a variable he couldn't calculate, so he eliminated it. Yet tonight, the image of Grace standing in his kitchen wouldn't leave his mind, sleeves rolled up, hair slightly undone, trying to bring warmth into a place he'd spent years keeping cold. She didn't belong in his world, and that terrified him, because she made him remember that once, a long time ago. He had wanted something simple too. By the time he returned home, the penthouse lights were dim. The faint scent of cooked food still lingered, butter, garlic, something human. He loosened his tie, walked to the window, and stared out at the city. From below, Seattle looked endless. From up here, it looked lonely. He pressed his palm to the glass, feeling the chill seep into his skin. "You chose this," he reminded himself. "This distance, this control." But for the first time in years, he wasn't sure if it still felt like peace. Grace's nights had become long and sleepless. The hum of the building was her only company, the occasional creak of metal, the sigh of the wind. She would lie awake, watching faint city lights reflect on the ceiling. That night, at 2:00 a.m., she got up for water, barefoot. She padded down the hallway. The air was cool, quiet except for the low sound of rain. Then she saw him. Ethan stood by the window, silhouetted against the city. His jacket hung on the back of a chair. His shirt sleeves rolled up. His tie was gone. He looked different undone somehow. He didn't notice her at first. His hands were pressed against the glass, his posture tense. The soft blue light from the city revealed the sharp lines of his face, but his eyes looked lost. For a long moment, Grace just watched him. She'd seen this man in magazines, on screens, surrounded by confidence and control. But here, in the dim quiet of his own home, he looked haunted, a man standing in the ruins of everything he thought he wanted. She took a step forward, The floor creaked. He turned. Their eyes met. It wasn't the brief, guarded glance of two people bound by obligation. It was something deeper, rawer like recognition. Neither of them spoke. The air between them seemed to hum. The city lights painted him in silver and shadow, and Grace felt something stir, fear, empathy, maybe both. Ethan's lips parted slightly, as if he might say something, but no words came. Instead, he gave the smallest nod, a gesture that said, "I see you." Grace nodded back, and for the first time since she had stepped into this glass cage, she didn't feel entirely invisible. When she went back to her room, her heart was still racing. In the hallway, the clock ticked softly, somewhere behind her. She knew Ethan was still standing at that window, staring into the night, fighting a battle he'd never admit was happening. The smell of roasted vegetables drifted through the penthouse that evening, the kind of scent that made a place feel like home, even if it wasn't one. Grace had begun cooking again, more to fill the silence than to eat. There was something comforting about the rhythm of it, the sound of the knife against the cutting board, the soft hiss of oil on the stove. It was Thursday. Ethan had texted earlier, dinner. 7:30. I'll be home. It was the first message in days that wasn't about logistics or appointments, just that dinner. Grace didn't know what possessed her to reply. All right. At precisely 7:31, the elevator chimed. Ethan stepped out in his usual tailored gray suit, jacket folded neatly over one arm. His eyes scanned the room, lingering briefly on the dining table where she had set 2 plates. "Smells good," he said, almost surprised by his own words. "I tried something simple," she replied, her voice polite, careful. "Salmon and roasted potatoes. I hope that's acceptable for a business dinner." His mouth curved slightly. "You don't have to treat every meal like a negotiation." Grace. Her name sounded strange coming from him, less like a formality and more like an acknowledgement. He sat across from her. The distance between them measured not by feet, but by walls of caution. The city lights outside painted the glass in reflections of silver and blue. For a few minutes, neither spoke. The only sound, the quiet clinking of utensils. Grace broke the silence first. "Do you ever stop working?" Ethan didn't look up. No. She tilted her head, studying him. Not even to breathe. He paused mid-bite, then set his fork down, eyes finally meeting hers. Work doesn't disappoint. His tone wasn't defensive, it was matter of fact, as if disappointment were an equation he'd solved long ago. Grace's voice softened. "That sounds lonely." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Loneliness is a choice." "Is it?" she asked quietly. "Or just a habit?" Something flickered in his eyes, not anger, not irritation, but recognition. He didn't answer. Instead, he took a sip of wine and changed the subject. "How are your medical appointments going?" Grace smiled faintly. "You mean the ones you don't attend?" A shadow of guilt crossed his expression. "I trust my doctor." "Of course," she said. "It's just biology, right?" The words hung between them like static. Ethan looked down, his hands tightening around his glass. After that, they ate in silence again. But it was a different kind of silence, not empty, not cold. It was the silence of two people who had accidentally peeled back a layer and didn't know what to do with what they'd found underneath. When the plates were cleared, Grace carried the dishes to the sink. She had dismissed the kitchen staff for the evening. She needed something to do with her hands, something to ground her. Ethan stood near the counter, pretending to scroll through his phone. She could feel his presence behind her, quiet, heavy, observant. She reached for a knife to rinse it sharp, sleek, too expensive for its own good. The moment her fingers brushed the blade, pain flared. Ah, a bead of red bloomed on her fingertip. Before she could react, Ethan was there. "Let me see." "It's nothing," she said quickly, but he was already reaching for her hand. His touch was firm but gentle, his brows furrowed in concentration, as if this minor cut were a crisis worth his full attention. He guided her toward the light, inspecting the small wound with the focus of a surgeon. "It's deeper than you think." Grace tried to pull her hand back, but his grip tightened slightly, not possessive, just protective. "I can handle it," she said softly. "I know," he murmured, his voice lower now. "But let me help anyway." He crossed the room to a drawer, retrieving a small first aid kit. She hadn't even known it existed. Of course he would have one, neatly stocked, precisely labeled. He cleaned the cut, his movements practiced, deliberate. Grace watched his face, the concentration in his jaw, the tension around his eyes. This was a man who solved billion-dollar problems without flinching, and yet a single drop of her blood made him uneasy. "Hold still," he said quietly. She did. The air between them shifted, the sterile scent of antiseptic mixed with something else, the faint trace of his cologne, warm and woody. Her pulse quickened. She wondered if he could feel it through her hand. When he finished wrapping the bandage, his thumb brushed against her skin, lingering a moment too long. The contact sent a ripple through her chest, something uninvited but undeniable. Their eyes met, neither spoke. The silence hummed again, thick with unspoken things. Grace was the first to look away. "Thank you," she whispered. Ethan cleared his throat, stepping back. "You should be more careful." "I usually am," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Maybe I was distracted." He looked at her, then really looked as if seeing something he hadn't noticed before. There was a question in his eyes, but he didn't ask it. Instead, he said, "I'll have Thomas stock more first aid supplies." Grace smiled faintly, half amused, half sad, always prepared. "It's better than chaos," he replied automatically. She tilted her head. "Maybe a little chaos is what makes us human." For a second, he didn't respond. Then, almost imperceptibly, he smiled. "Good night, Grace. Good night, Ethan." When she left the kitchen, the faint scent of lavender soap lingered behind her. Ethan stood there for a long time, staring at the small white bandage he had placed on her hand. His fingers still tingled where he'd touched her. It was absurd. He didn't believe in these things in reactions without logic, in warmth without reason. But the sensation stayed. He looked down at his own hand, turning it slowly, as if the answer might be written there. Nothing. Just skin and memory, and yet the warmth wouldn't leave. Ethan exhaled, low and sharp, as if to shake it off. But when he walked toward his office, he caught sight of the empty wine glass she had used a faint smudge of her lipstick at the rim. He hesitated, then reached for it. His thumb brushed over the mark before he set it down again. It wasn't part of the plan. None of this was... Control was peace. Feelings were chaos. So why did the chaos feel so alive? He turned off the lights, but the question followed him into the dark. The storm began just after midnight. Wind pressed against the glass walls of the penthouse, and the rain came in sheets hard, relentless, like the city itself was trying to wash something clean. Grace lay awake in the dim light, the sound of thunder rolling through the distance. Sleep had become a stranger lately. Her mind wouldn't stop turning thoughts of what she had agreed to, of the quiet days that all looked the same, and of Ethan, who was both everywhere and nowhere. Finally, she gave up on rest. Slipping on her robe, she padded barefoot down the hallway, guided by the soft glow from the city below. The air smelled faintly of whiskey and rain, and that was when she saw him. Ethan stood by the window, his reflection fractured by the lightning. He wasn't in his usual armor of control, no tie, no jacket. His shirt was half unbuttoned, sleeves rolled up, hair slightly tousled as if he'd run his hands through it too many times. In one hand, he held a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid catching flashes of light from the storm. He didn't turn when she entered, but his voice carried across the quiet room. "Can't sleep." She froze, surprised. "You heard me?" "I hear everything in this place," he said, his tone softer than usual. "It's too quiet not to." Grace hesitated near the doorway. "I was just making tea." He gestured toward the bottle on the table. "Whiskey's faster." A small smile tugged at her lips. "I think I'll stick with tea." Ethan finally turned to face her. For a moment, the sight of him caught her breath, not because of the sharpness of his features, but because he looked tired, truly tired, the kind of exhaustion that no amount of sleep could fix. "Sit," he said quietly, nodding toward the sofa. "You don't have to stand there like you're trespassing." She crossed the room and sat opposite him, tucking her legs beneath her. The storm outside painted moving shadows on the walls, lightning tracing pale scars of light across the glass. For a long time, neither spoke. The clock ticked faintly, and the rain filled the silence. Grace finally broke it. "Do you ever stop thinking?" He gave a low, humorless laugh. "No, that's the problem. About work. About everything I can control," he said, taking another sip. "And everything you can't." His jaw tightened. "I pretend it doesn't exist." Grace studied him for a moment. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, those sharp, gray-blue eyes, were tired in a way that went deeper than sleep. "You don't have to pretend with me," she said softly. He turned his gaze toward her, and for once, he didn't deflect. "You think pretending keeps people safe? It doesn't. It just makes you forget what feeling alive used to mean." She didn't know what to say to that. Ethan leaned back, his voice quieter now. "I used to think if I worked hard enough, built enough walls, nothing could touch me again. No loss, no pain." Her heart skipped. Again. He hesitated. The silence stretched too long before he spoke. "There was someone once." Grace waited. He swirled the whiskey in his glass, staring into it as if it held the memory. "Her name was Emily. We were married almost 5 years. She died." The storm punctuated his words with a crack of thunder, and for a moment, Grace thought he wouldn't continue. He took a long breath. "Car accident. A hit and run. I was in London on business. Missed her last call." His voice didn't shake, but the tremor was in the space between his words and the way he looked anywhere but at her. Grace's throat tightened. "I'm sorry," he nodded once. "It was a long time ago, but not long enough," she said gently. He looked at her then, really looked. "You talk like you've lost something too." She smiled faintly. "My mother, cancer, last year." Their eyes held two people sitting in a glass fortress above a city full of strangers, bound by something neither of them had planned: grief. Ethan's expression softened, almost imperceptibly. "That's why you needed the money." Grace nodded. "Hospitals don't wait for feelings." Something shifted in his gaze, a crack in the armor he'd spent years building. He reached out, hesitated, then set his glass down and leaned forward slightly. "It doesn't go away," he said quietly. "You just learn how to breathe around it." She looked down at her hands. "Some days. I'm not sure I remember how." The room was warm, but she shivered. Maybe it was the thunder. Maybe it was his eyes, intense, unguarded, reflecting something she hadn't seen before: empathy. Without thinking, he reached out. His fingers brushed a loose strand of hair from her face. The touch was barely there, light as air, but it froze her in place. Grace's breath caught. "Ethan!" He didn't answer. His hand lingered near her cheek for a heartbeat longer than it should have. She could smell the faint whiskey on his skin, mixed with the clean scent of rain and cedar. Outside, thunder rolled again, closer this time. Ethan's eyes darkened. His voice, when he spoke, was low and rough. "You should sleep. I can't. Neither can I." The space between them seemed to shrink. The storm raged against the glass, wind howling, rain streaking down the windows like tears. For one suspended moment, the world was nothing but the sound of the rain and the closeness of two people who had forgotten how to touch without breaking. He leaned forward just slightly, his breath warm against her temple. Grace's heart pounded so loud she could hear it in her ears. "Ethan!" she whispered, but she didn't pull away. Their faces were inches apart. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of whiskey and the weight of everything unsaid. Then a deafening crack of thunder split the night. Grace startled, pulling back. Ethan blinked as though waking from a dream. The tension snapped like a rubber band stretched too far. For a moment, neither moved. Then he stood abruptly, running a hand through his hair. "I'm sorry. You don't have to be," she said softly. But he already was. He turned toward the window again, jaw set, shoulders tight. "Go to bed. Grace." She lingered, wanting to say something, anything that would bridge the growing distance again, but no words came. When she finally retreated down the hallway, the echo of thunder followed her. She stopped at the corner, looking back. Ethan was still there, his reflection caught in the glass. A man staring out into the storm, haunted by ghosts he couldn't name and warmth he didn't know how to hold. The clinic didn't look like a place where life began. It looked like a bank, white walls, glass partitions, the faint hum of air conditioning, the sterile scent of disinfectant masking the truth of what people came here for. Grace sat in the waiting room, hands clenched tightly in her lap. Across from her, a young couple whispered to each other, their faces bright with nervous hope. To her left, a woman flipped through a glossy parenting magazine, smiling faintly at the pictures. Grace felt like an intruder in a world meant for love and anticipation. She had neither, just a contract. The receptionist smiled politely. "Mrs. Ward, you can wait in the private room. Mr. Ward has already arrived." Grace froze. "He's here?" Of course he was. Ethan Ward didn't trust anyone. Not lawyers, not board members, not even fate. He oversaw everything. The nurse led her down a quiet hallway to a sleek, glass-doored suite labeled private consultation. When Grace stepped inside, Ethan was sitting on a gray sofa, his posture perfect, a medical file in his hands. He looked like he was reviewing a quarterly report, not preparing to discuss conception. "Ethan," she greeted, her voice low. He looked up. Grace. His gaze flickered over her clinical, careful. "I thought it was important that I be here." "For what supervision? For support," he said, though his tone didn't sound like support. Grace took a seat opposite him, her palms damp. "You don't have to do this." "I know," he said simply. "But I want to." Before she could respond, the door opened and a doctor entered, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes behind professional detachment. "Mr. and Mrs. Ward." "Good morning. I'm Dr. Harper. We'll start with some preliminary examinations." Grace nodded, forcing a smile. Ethan gave a curt handshake, his usual precision intact. When the doctor asked her to change into a gown, Grace hesitated. Ethan stood near the window, giving her what privacy he could, but the air felt suffocating. Every sound, the rustle of paper, the soft click of instruments seemed magnified. When she lay on the exam table, the cold sheet against her back sent a shiver through her. The doctor adjusted the ultrasound machine, her voice calm, professional. "This will be quick." Grace stared at the ceiling tiles. Each sterile square felt like a mile between her and her own dignity. Then she felt a touch, gentle, uncertain. Ethan had moved closer. He stood beside the table, his face unreadable but his hand reaching out. His fingers wrapped around hers, hesitant at first, then firmer when she didn't pull away. Grace turned her head, meeting his gaze. For once, there was no calculation in his eyes, just something raw, human. The doctor's voice was distant, explaining things Grace barely heard: hormone levels, follicle counts, optimal cycles. None of it mattered. All she could focus on was the warmth of Ethan's hand, the steady pulse beneath his skin. When it was over, she dressed quickly, cheeks burning with humiliation she couldn't explain. Ethan stood by the door, silent. As they left, he spoke quietly. "You didn't have to go through that alone." She looked at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wasn't alone. I just felt like I was." He flinched, ever so slightly. "I'm sorry." 2 words she had never expected to hear from him. That night, the storm had returned, a quieter one this time, the kind that whispered against the windows instead of screaming. Grace sat by the fireplace, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea she didn't drink. She replayed the day in her mind, the doctor's calm voice, the chill of the room, Ethan's unexpected gentleness. She hated that it had meant something to her, hated that a single touch could shake her this deeply. Footsteps echoed behind her. She didn't have to turn to know it was him. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked softly. She shook her head. "Seems to be a pattern for us." Ethan stopped near the armchair opposite hers. "I wanted to make sure you were okay." Grace looked up at him, studying his face in the firelight. Why? He hesitated, because today shouldn't have felt like that. "Cold, cruel," he admitted. She swallowed hard. "Then why do it this way?" "Because feelings complicate everything." She let out a quiet laugh. "You say that like it's a bad thing." He stepped closer, the glow of the fire catching the faint exhaustion around his eyes. "You don't understand. When you start feeling, you lose control. And when you lose control, you remember you're human." She finished for him. The silence between them stretched fragile. Dangerous. Ethan's gaze softened. He reached out, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. The gesture was almost instinctive, but his fingers lingered just a moment too long. Grace's breath caught. She should have pulled away. She didn't. The air seemed to thicken, heavy with things neither of them could say. When he cupped her face, she didn't resist. His thumb traced her cheekbone, slow, reverent, as though memorizing something he wasn't allowed to keep. "Ethan." He closed the distance before she could finish. The kiss was hesitant at first, almost questioning, then deeper, desperate, searching. Grace's hands found his chest, then his shoulders, clutching at him like she needed proof that this was real. He pulled her closer, the years of restraint crumbling beneath something he couldn't name. There was no contract in that moment, no transaction. Just two people colliding under the weight of loneliness too heavy to bear alone. When he carried her to his room, the world outside disappeared. The storm, the city, the silence all fell away. What remained was heat, breath, skin, and the sound of her name on his lips as though it were a confession. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't gentle. It was raw and real and aching. And when it was over, the quiet returned heavy and suffocating. Grace lay beside him, staring at the ceiling. For a moment, she thought he might speak, might say something that would make sense of what had just happened. But he didn't. Ethan sat up, reaching for his shirt. The firelight caught the hard set of his jaw. "That shouldn't have happened," he said finally. Her chest tightened. "What?" He didn't look at her. Tonight? It was a mistake." The words hit harder than they should have. Grace pulled the sheet around her, her voice breaking. "A mistake." He stood, fastening the buttons of his shirt with mechanical precision. "We lost perspective. It won't happen again." Grace felt the sting of tears she refused to shed. "Don't worry, I won't make that mistake twice." He froze, but didn't turn around. "Grace, just go," she whispered. Ethan hesitated. Then, without another word, he left. The door closed softly, but the sound was final, like a seal on something fragile breaking apart. Grace sat there, the firelight flickering over her face. The warmth of him still lingered on her skin, but it felt like an illusion now fading fast. She buried her face in her hands and let the tears fall, quiet and unrelenting. "Maybe I was the mistake," she whispered into the darkness. Outside, the rain began again, soft, steady, and endless. The penthouse grew quiet again, not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the thick, heavy silence that comes after something breaks. Ethan Ward went back to his office the next morning, as though nothing had happened. He had mastered that art, compartmentalizing, sealing off anything that didn't fit neatly into logic. Meetings, contracts, projections, numbers didn't bleed, and spreadsheets didn't cry. He told himself that returning to work was discipline. In truth, It was avoidance. Grace, meanwhile, stayed in her room most days. The housekeepers came and went in near silence. Meals arrived on schedule, untouched. Her reflection in the mirror grew paler with each sunrise. It wasn't just the emotional exhaustion. Her body felt heavy, weak. Some mornings, she could barely stand long enough to shower. The smell of coffee made her nauseous. She told herself it was stress, nothing more. But deep down, she knew her body was whispering what her heart already screamed. She couldn't keep living like this. Ethan noticed the absence before he admitted it. Her laughter, soft and uncertain, had vanished. The faint scent of her perfume no longer lingered in the hall. Even the sound of her footsteps, that quiet rhythm that used to echo faintly through the marble floors, was gone. It should have made things easier. It didn't. He caught himself glancing at her closed door too often. Caught himself checking his phone for messages that weren't coming. Caught himself wondering if she was eating, sleeping, breathing. He buried the questions under work. When his father called, he forced composure into his voice. Progress. Samuel Ward's tone was clipped, cold. "The process is underway," Ethan replied, eyes on his monitor. "Everything is under control." "Control," his father repeated. "That's what keeps things from falling apart. Remember that, son." Ethan hung up and stared at the city below. He used to believe that too, but lately, control felt more like suffocation. By the third day, he found her fainted on the kitchen floor. It was early evening. He had come home late, again, to find the apartment dimly lit, the dinner tray untouched. Then he saw her slumped against the cabinet, pale as paper. Grace. He was on his knees before he knew what he was doing, his hands shaking as he lifted her gently. Her skin was clammy, her breathing shallow. A glass of water lay shattered nearby. "Grace, wake up," he said, voice cracking. "Come on." Her eyelids fluttered, then opened halfway. "Ethan, don't talk." He slipped an arm beneath her shoulders, supporting her head. "You're okay. I've got you. I just got dizzy. You passed out." She tried to smile, weakly. "Guess I'm not as strong as I thought." He didn't answer. His chest felt too tight for words. Within minutes, he had called Dr. Avery Ross, their attending physician, and by the time she arrived, he was pacing like a man waiting for a verdict. Dr. Ross knelt beside Grace, checking her pulse, her pupils, her temperature, dehydration. She murmured, "Exhaustion, possibly low blood pressure. She needs rest and food. Has she been under unusual stress?" Ethan looked away. "Yes, Dr." Ross's eyes flicked toward him knowingly. "Then that's your answer." Grace stirred again, whispering faintly, "I'm fine. Really? Just tired." "You're not fine, Doctor," Ross said firmly. "You need care." Ethan followed the doctor's instructions, brought water, propped her up with pillows, sat beside her while she rested. Hours later, when Dr. Ross finally left, the penthouse was quiet again. Grace slept soundly for the first time in days. Ethan stayed beside her bed, elbows on his knees, head in his hands. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt fear like that. Not since the phone call that told him Emily, his wife, was gone. It was the same feeling now, sharp and hollow, like the floor had vanished beneath him. He looked at Grace, her breathing slow and even, one hand resting lightly on the blanket. She was fragile in that moment, but not weak. There was a strength to her even in sleep, the kind that came from surviving things no one saw. He thought of all the ways he'd pushed her away the distance, the cruelty of his detachment, the way he'd called their night together a mistake. And yet, when she'd fallen, the only thought in his head had been please. Let her be okay. The truth hit him like a blow. His fear wasn't about control. It was care, real, unguarded, terrifying care. He sat there until dawn, unable to move. Dr. Ross returned the next morning. She found him by the window, still in the same clothes, dark circles beneath his eyes. "She's stable," the doctor said gently, "but this won't fix itself. Stress, emotional strain, These things have a cost. Ethan didn't look at her. She's strong. Even the strongest people break when you build walls around them. Her voice was calm, but her eyes were sharp. You can't keep building walls and expect her to stay breathing inside them. Ethan's jaw tightened. "You're assuming I'm not assuming anything," she interrupted softly. "I've seen enough to know. You care about her, but caring from a distance doesn't save anyone. Ethan, it only makes you lonelier." He said nothing. His hand clenched into a fist at his side. "Doctor," Ross sighed, "whatever you're trying to protect yourself from, you're punishing her for it instead." When she left, her words stayed behind, circling, echoing, refusing to fade. You can't keep building walls and expect her to stay breathing inside them. That night, Ethan stood outside Grace's door again. He didn't knock. He couldn't. He just listened the sound of her breathing, faint but steady, reaching him through the quiet. For the first time in years, he felt something break inside his chest, something he couldn't name and didn't want to. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was love, maybe it was both. He pressed a hand to the door, closing his eyes. "Rest," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Please, just rest." And for once, the man who controlled everything, the man who planned every outcome, measured every risk, had no plan at all. The invitation had arrived weeks ago, embossed in silver and sealed with the emblem of the Seattle Foundation for Innovation. It was an event Ethan Ward couldn't refuse, a gathering of investors, partners, and competitors. The kind of night where appearances were everything and emotions were liabilities. Yet, as he fastened his cufflinks in the mirror that evening, he felt the faint weight of something he couldn't quite name, a flicker of hesitation. For the first time in years, he wasn't worried about what the board would think. He was worried about her. Grace had barely spoken to him since the night she fainted. Her recovery had been quiet but distant, her voice polite, her eyes elsewhere. When he told her about the gala, she had only nodded. Of course. Whatever you need. He wanted to say it wasn't about need, but the words never came. When she emerged from her room that night, Ethan forgot how to breathe. The gown she wore was midnight blue, the color of calm seas and sleepless nights. Its fabric shimmered subtly beneath the light, catching every movement like water. Her hair was swept back loosely, a few strands framing her face. She looked breathtaking and heartbreakingly unreachable. "You look..." He caught himself before the word beautiful escaped. "Elegant." Grace smiled faintly. "Thank you. I suppose elegance photographs, well..." He frowned at the edge in her tone, but didn't respond. Instead, he offered his arm, and she took it not out of affection, but obligation. They rode down in silence, the elevator's reflection catching their uneasy symmetry. Two people bound by something that no longer fit its definition. The gala was held in the glass atrium of a downtown hotel, all chandeliers and champagne, the murmur of wealth and calculation blending beneath the soft strains of a string quartet. As they entered, cameras flashed. Ethan felt the familiar armor of public composure settle over him. Smile, handshake, nod. Grace followed beside him, her posture graceful, her eyes calm, though her fingers tightened slightly around her clutch. "She's lovely," one of the board members whispered to another. Ethan pretended not to hear, but a quiet surge of pride stirred in his chest. They mingled, or rather, he did. Grace stood near the refreshment table, sipping water, observing quietly. She didn't belong in this world of rehearsed laughter and hidden agendas, and somehow that made her stand out even more. That was when he noticed the man speaking to her. Daniel Hayes, journalist, 35, charismatic, the kind of man who wore kindness easily. Ethan knew him by reputation, sharp, fair, disarming. Grace seemed lighter around him. He made her laugh, a small, genuine sound Ethan hadn't heard in weeks. From across the room, Ethan's chest tightened. Hayes said something that made her cover her mouth, smiling. Ethan's jaw flexed. His grip on his glass tightened until the stem nearly snapped. He excused himself from the conversation he'd been pretending to enjoy and crossed the floor. "Mr. Hayes," he greeted, voice cool, practiced. The journalist turned, offering an easy smile. "Mr. Ward, good to see you again. I was just telling your wife how inspiring your latest foundation project sounds." Wife. The word felt heavier than usual. Ethan's eyes flicked to Grace. She looked between them, cautious. "Daniel was asking about the company's scholarship program," she said, her tone steady. "Of course," Ethan replied, his gaze steady but sharp. "My wife is well informed." Hayes nodded politely, unbothered by the tension in Ethan's posture. It's rare to see both intellect and empathy in the same partnership. You're a fortunate man. "Mr. Ward." Ethan forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Yes, I am." When Hayes excused himself to greet another guest, Ethan turned to Grace. Her smile faded. "What was that?" "Nothing," he said. "Too quickly." "Ethan." He leaned in slightly, his voice low. "Don't smile at him like that." Her brows furrowed. "Like what?" "Like he matters." The words came out before he could stop them. Grace blinked, stunned. He was being polite. I was being polite. He stepped closer, his composure cracking. "You don't understand how people like him think. He treated me like a person," she snapped. "You treat me like a shadow." The air between them thickened, charged with something electric: anger, jealousy, pain, all bleeding together. "Grace," he said, voice rough. "You're not listening." "No, you're not." Her eyes glistened with hurt. "You think control protects people, but it only isolates you. You build walls, and then you hate everyone for standing outside them. Stop." "Why?" "Because I'm right." He grabbed her arm, not hard, but enough to make her gasp. "You don't get to talk to me like that." Her pulse raced under his grip. "And you don't get to own me." They stared at each other, fury and longing crashing like waves against steel. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then, in a blur of emotion he didn't recognize, Ethan pulled her closer. His mouth found hers before thought could intervene, a desperate, consuming kiss that burned through every rule he'd made. Grace froze for half a second. Then her body betrayed her anger, responding, trembling. Her hands pressed against his chest, not to push him away, but to feel the impossible proof that he was real. It wasn't tenderness. It was chaos, raw and confusing. When she finally broke the kiss, she was breathing hard, her lips trembling. What the hell was that? He stared at her, eyes wide, the heat of the moment still pulsing between them. Before he could speak, her hand came up sharply. The slap echoed in the narrow backstage corridor. Grace's voice was low, shaking but fierce. "You can't own me. Ethan!" He stood there, stunned, one hand at his jaw, his chest heaving. She stepped back, eyes burning. "You can't keep punishing me for feelings you're afraid to have." And then she walked away, her heels clicking against the marble, each step more resolute than the last. Ethan didn't follow. He couldn't. The sound of her slap still rang in his ears, louder than the storm that raged the night they first almost kissed. When he finally looked up, the reflection in the window showed a man he barely recognized. Not the polished CEO, not the grieving widower, but someone stripped bare of excuses, someone who wanted her and hated himself for it. The morning after the gala, the penthouse felt colder. Grace woke to find the other side of the bed untouched, perfectly smooth, the sheets still crisp. Ethan was gone. Greg, the driver, informed her that Mr. Ward had left for business travel. No explanation, no message, no return date. Grace nodded numbly, pretending not to care, but she did. Days passed. Rain came and went in waves, the sound against the glass like a heartbeat she couldn't quiet. The sky stayed the same dull gray that had hung over them since the night everything changed. Ethan's absence was everywhere in the silence, in the empty chair at the dining table, in the faint echo of his voice when she tried to forget it. She tried to fill the void with small routines, watering the plants, reading half-finished novels, folding laundry that wasn't hers. But every corner of the apartment reminded her of him, his precision, his order, his need for control. She hated that she missed him. She hated even more that she understood why. On the third day, she sat at her laptop. The cursor blinked against a blank email screen, taunting her with its silence. She hesitated for a long time before typing to Daniel Hayes. Subject: I need advice. Hi, Daniel. I know we barely know each other, but you were the first person in a long time who spoke to me like I mattered. Things at home have become complicated. I don't know who to talk to. I'm not looking for anything inappropriate. I just need someone to remind me that I'm not crazy for wanting to feel seen. I don't know what to do anymore. Grace. She stared at it for nearly an hour. Then she hit save draft and closed the laptop. She couldn't send it, not because she didn't want to reach out, but because she already knew what Ethan would think if he ever saw it. That night, she fell asleep on the couch, the hum of the rain lulling her into uneasy dreams. Ethan returned 2 days later. He entered quietly, his expression unreadable. The storm outside mirrored the one in his eyes, dark, restless, threatening to spill over. His clothes were damp, his jaw unshaven, his posture tighter than usual. Grace looked up from the couch. You're back? He dropped his keys on the counter. Did you think I wouldn't be? I wasn't sure, she said softly. He didn't respond. He walked past her, into his office, the door closing with that precise click that always felt like a lock turning between them. Grace exhaled shakily. The distance between them had become unbearable, yet neither of them knew how to cross it. Hours later, she heard his voice from the study, sharp, controlled, then silence, then the sound of something hitting the desk. When she went to check, the door was ajar. Ethan was standing by his computer, the laptop open, his knuckles white against the edge of the desk. Her heart dropped when she saw the screen, her email draft. Ethan! He turned sharply. What is this? She froze. It's nothing, just a draft. I never sent it. I need advice. From him, his voice was low but trembling with fury. You were planning to run to that journalist, the one who couldn't take his eyes off you. That's not fair, she said, her voice rising. I wasn't planning anything. I just what? He took a step closer. Needed someone else to listen. Someone other than the man paying for everything you have. Grace's chest tightened. You think this is about money? I think it's about betrayal. She shook her head, tears forming. You left. Ethan, you didn't call. You didn't write. You didn't care. I was giving us space. No, you were running. His eyes flashed. I was trying to think about what she cried, about how to feel without losing control. Don't twist this, he snapped. I trusted you. Grace trusted me. You've never trusted me. Her voice broke. You watch me like I'm some experiment you can predict. You control everything what I do, where I go, who I talk to, and then you call that trust. Ethan's face hardened, but his voice cracked beneath it. You don't understand what it's like to lose someone because you did trust them. The words hit her like a blow. She stepped back, whispering, You're not talking about me, are you? He looked away. Silence stretched between them, raw and suffocating. Then she said it, the thing she'd been holding back for months. I was never your prisoner, Ethan, but you've been mine. He froze, breathing ragged. The rain outside grew louder, pounding against the glass like the city itself was listening. Grace, no, she said, trembling. You can't keep breaking me just to prove you're still in control. I can't live like that. His jaw tightened. You don't mean that. I do. The finality in her voice cut through the air. Ethan's control snapped. Then what do you want from me? He shouted. You want me to fall apart. You want me to confess that I care about you when I'm not supposed to. Her eyes filled with tears. I just want you to see me. For a moment, his face twisted anger, pain, love, all colliding in the space of a breath. Then he turned away. "I can't," he said hoarsely. And just like that, he was gone. The door slammed, thunder cracked, and rain poured harder than it had all year. Grace stood there, her chest heaving, her hands trembling. The echo of his footsteps faded down the hallway until there was nothing left but the storm. She collapsed onto the couch, her body shaking. For the first time since she signed that contract, she let herself cry, not quietly, not politely, but with all the pain she'd been holding back. Outside, the city drowned in rain. Inside, everything she'd built with him, fragile, uncertain, almost real, washed away. The storm didn't stop that night. It pounded against the glass like the sky was trying to warn her or wash everything away. Grace had barely slept. The argument replayed in her mind, Ethan's voice echoing in every corner of the penthouse. She told herself she wouldn't cry again, but her body didn't listen. By morning, her head throbbed, her stomach ached, and the world spun whenever she tried to stand. She pressed a hand to the counter to steady herself, but the dizziness came in waves. Her breath caught. Then came the pain, sharp, deep, twisting. She gasped, clutching her abdomen. "No, no, please." The glass of water she'd been holding shattered on the floor. She tried to call out, but her voice broke into a whisper. A warm wetness spread beneath her feet. Blood. Panic blurred everything. Her trembling fingers reached for the phone, dialing the only number that mattered. "Dr. Ross," she choked out when the line picked up. "Something's wrong. The baby." The words dissolved into a sob. "I'm calling an ambulance. Dr. Ross said immediately. "Stay still. Grace, don't move. Help is on the way." The phone slipped from Grace's hand. The last thing she saw before darkness pulled her under was the rain streaking down the window, tears from a sky that couldn't save her. Dr. Avery Ross called Ethan herself. It was almost midnight. He was at his office, sitting alone, drowning in numbers that didn't matter anymore. When the phone rang, he almost ignored it. But the moment he heard her voice, his world shifted. "Ethan," she said, her tone urgent. "It's Grace." He was on his feet before she finished the sentence. "What happened?" She collapsed, internal bleeding. "We're stabilizing her now?" His throat closed. "And the baby. I don't know yet." He didn't remember the drive to the hospital, only the sound of the rain hammering against the windshield, his own heartbeat deafening in his ears. He ran through the automatic doors drenched, breathless. The sterile scent of antiseptic hit him like a wall. Dr. Ross met him at the end of the corridor, her scrub stained, her eyes tired. "She's alive," the doctor said softly. Ethan's knees nearly gave out. "And the baby, Doctor?" Ross exhaled, still holding on. "You were lucky if she'd waited any longer. It might have been different." He pressed a hand to his forehead, his body shaking. "Can I see her?" "She's still sedated." "Doctor," Ross said gently. "But yes. Go." The room was dim, machines humming softly like distant whispers. Grace lay motionless beneath white sheets, pale but breathing. Her hands, always warm and restless, now looked fragile against the blanket. Ethan moved closer, his throat thick. He didn't know what to say. "How do you speak to someone you've almost destroyed?" His hand hovered above hers before finally resting on it. Her skin was cold. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "God, Grace, I'm so sorry." The words cracked open something inside him. For the first time in years, he couldn't hide behind logic, couldn't retreat into control. Tears filled his eyes, foreign, unwelcome, unstoppable. He bowed his head against her hand. "I almost lost you. I almost lost both of you because I couldn't admit I care." He drew a trembling breath, his voice breaking. "I told myself this was supposed to be simple, a contract, a business arrangement. But then you smiled, you argued, you made me feel things I didn't want to feel, and I punished you for it." He laughed softly, a sound of regret, not amusement. "You said I built walls. You were right. But what you didn't know, Grace, is that I was trapped inside them. 2. He pressed her hand to his lips, closing his eyes. Please, just wake up. I'll do better, I swear. Minutes, maybe hours passed. The storm outside softened to a drizzle, as if the world was finally breathing again. Then a small sound. Grace stirred, a weak groan escaping her lips. Her eyelashes fluttered, and slowly, her eyes opened. Ethan, her voice was faint, almost childlike. He straightened immediately, leaning closer. I'm here. You're okay. You're safe. She blinked at the tubes, the machines, the sterile ceiling lights. The baby. His voice trembled, still strong. Doctor, Ross said you both made it through. Tears welled in her eyes. Thank God. He brushed a strand of hair from her forehead, his hand trembling. Don't ever scare me like that again. She managed a tired smile. Guess I'm more trouble than you planned for. He shook his head, a broken laugh escaping him. You have no idea. Silence settled between them, not the cold silence they had shared before, but something softer, fragile, human. Ethan reached for her hand again, gripping it tightly. Grace, I need to tell you something. Her eyes were heavy with exhaustion, but she listened. I've been a coward, he said quietly. I thought control meant strength. I thought love was weakness. But I was wrong. It's fear that weakens you, fear of losing someone before you ever let yourself have them. Grace's fingers twitched in his. Ethan, I almost lost both of you, he whispered, because I was too proud to admit I care. Her eyes glistened, her lips parting in a faint smile. Then stop pretending. The simplicity of her words broke him all over again. He leaned closer, his forehead against hers. I will, he whispered. I swear I will. She drifted back to sleep with his hand still in hers, the steady rhythm of her breathing syncing with the beeping of the heart monitor. Ethan stayed there all night, not moving, afraid that if he blinked too long, she might disappear again. And for the first time, the man who'd built his empire on control understood what it meant to surrender, not to defeat, but to love. Hospitals have their own kind of silence, a sterile, humming quiet, filled with the soft rhythm of machines and distant footsteps. For Grace, that silence was both comforting and strange. She had spent her life caring for others, her patients, her mother, and now she was the one being watched, tended, protected. The shift felt foreign, almost embarrassing, but each time she opened her eyes, Ethan was there. He never left the chair beside her bed. The first morning she woke after the crisis, she found him asleep, slumped awkwardly forward, his head resting on his crossed arms. The sharp, commanding man she'd once thought of as unshakable looked utterly human, dark circles under his eyes. His hair a mess. His suit jacket wrinkled beyond repair. When she moved slightly, his head lifted immediately. You're awake, he said softly, voice gravelly from exhaustion. You should sleep, she murmured. He gave a small smile. Not a chance. There was warmth in his tone, tentative, careful, but real. It was the first time in months that she'd heard that version of him over the next few days. Doctor, Ross insisted on strict bed rest, no stress. She warned Ethan, and no arguments. I'll behave, he promised, his hand raised in mock surrender. Grace smirked faintly from the bed. I'll believe that when I see it. He looked at her, a flicker of humor in his eyes. You're feeling better if you're brave enough to challenge me again? Maybe I'm just tired of losing, she said softly. Something in his expression softened guilt, affection, maybe both. He pulled a chair closer and began reading the newspaper out loud, his deep voice steady and rhythmic. He didn't notice that she wasn't really listening to the words, she was listening to the sound, the steadiness of it, the safety in it. When she was discharged home, Ethan refused to let anyone else care for her. Thomas, the butler, offered to resume household duties, but Ethan waved him off. I've got it. And he did. He learned to cook badly, at first. The first morning, the smoke alarm went off twice. Grace laughed so hard she nearly cried. I swear I followed the recipe, he said, holding up a charred pan of scrambled eggs that looked like asphalt. What recipe, she teased? The one in a demolition manual? He grinned. A real grin this time. Mockery isn't part of your treatment plan. Neither is smoke inhalation, she shot back. From that day on, their mornings were lighter, full of hesitant laughter and tiny moments of peace. Afternoons became their ritual of stillness. He'd bring her tea and a book, then sit by the window while she read aloud. Sometimes she'd ask about his childhood, and to her surprise, he answered. He told her about growing up under the shadow of his father, the constant expectation to be more, do more, feel less. About how he'd lost his mother young, and how that silence between father and son had turned into armor he never took off. Grace listened quietly, her heart aching for the boy he'd been. And when he asked about her mother's illness, her years as a nurse, her love for old jazz music, she smiled through the bitter sweetness of it all. I used to dance with Mom in the kitchen, she said. She'd hum to Ella Fitzgerald while stirring soup. I was 8, standing on her feet, pretending to be graceful. Ethan's lips curved faintly. You still are? Grace blinked, surprised. What graceful? He said simply. Her heart tripped over the word. For once, it didn't sound like flattery. It sounded like truth. The more time they spent in that quiet rhythm, the more they began to rediscover something that had been missing all along. Not passion, not control, but humanity. Ethan, who had built his life around efficiency, started slowing down. He noticed small things, the way Grace tilted her head when she read, the way her eyes softened when she talked about her sister, the way her smile lingered after laughter. Grace, in turn, saw a different side of him. The man who once signed contracts like declarations of war now burned toast because he got distracted by a sunrise. The man who once couldn't say I care without choking on the words now tucked a blanket around her shoulders without needing to explain why. They didn't talk about the contract anymore. It had become irrelevant, like a ghost that had finally faded. One evening, as the city outside glowed under a soft drizzle, Grace asked quietly, Do you ever miss who you were before all this? Ethan looked out the window, his reflection faint in the glass. Sometimes, he was easier to control, but was he happier? He turned toward her. The answer came slowly. No. He was just quieter about his misery. She smiled faintly. You talk like a man who's starting to like being alive again. He tilted his head. Maybe I'm learning. Their eyes met steady, unguarded. It was a small, quiet moment, but it carried more weight than any kiss they'd shared. That night, after she'd fallen asleep, Ethan stayed beside her. He read until the words blurred, then just watched her breathe the slow, rhythmic rise and fall that reassured him more than anything else in the world. He thought about how fragile everything was, how easily love could be lost in the noise of fear and pride. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of the bedside lamp. Rain whispered against the glass again, gentler this time. He reached for her hand, his fingers brushing hers lightly. She stirred but didn't wake. Her hand found his almost instinctively, curling around it. He smiled, small, tired, genuine, and leaned back in the chair. Sleep came quietly, like forgiveness. By the time dawn painted the sky pale gold, Ethan Ward, the man who had once sworn he didn't need love, was asleep beside the woman who had taught him how to feel again, her hand still safe in his. The fire crackled softly that evening, painting the room in warm amber light. Outside, the world was quiet, no rain, no thunder, just the low hum of the city beneath a calm winter sky. Grace sat curled up on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, her hair loose over her shoulders. She looked stronger now, still pale, still fragile, but alive in a way that filled the room. Ethan stood by the window, his silhouette framed by the reflection of the flames. He'd been quiet all night, restless, turning his glass in his hands but barely drinking from it. Grace had learned by now not to push. Some truths had to be spoken, but only when they were ready to be born. Finally, he spoke. "I keep thinking about the crash," he said, voice low. Grace looked up slowly. "Ethan?" He didn't turn around. It was raining. I'd told her I'd be home late. I'd missed 3 dinners that week, all because I couldn't step away from work. She called me just once. I ignored it. I was in a meeting? He drew a sharp breath. 20 minutes later, her car was hit by a drunk driver. She was gone before they even got her out. The words hung in the air, heavy, fragile, and final. Grace's hand went to her mouth. "Oh, Ethan?" He stared out at the skyline, his reflection fractured in the glass. I remember the way the phone rang. I remember not answering because I thought whatever she wanted could wait until morning. His voice cracked just slightly, and for the first time, Grace saw the man behind all the armor. When the police called, he continued. "I drove to the hospital, but they wouldn't let me in the room. They said it was too late. I didn't even get to say goodbye." He laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "And you know what I thought about on the way home. Not our life. I thought about how this would look to the board, what kind of statement I'd have to release." He turned then, eyes glinting in the firelight. "That's the kind of man I was." Grace's throat ached. She wanted to tell him he wasn't that man anymore, but she knew he needed to finish. He moved toward the fire, setting the glass down on the mantel. "After she died, I made a decision. I told myself love was punishment, a trick that fools you into lowering your guard before it takes everything away. So, I stopped trying. I buried myself in work. I shut everyone out." He looked at her then, the flames reflected in his eyes. "Until you—" Grace held his gaze, unmoving. "At first," he said quietly, "I thought you were just another problem to manage, a contract to complete. But then you kept being you. You challenged me, infuriated me, made me want to be a better man even when I didn't believe I could be one." He took a slow step closer. "You made me feel alive again, and I hated it. Because if I could feel, I could lose. And if I could lose, I could break." Grace's lips trembled, but she stayed silent, her eyes never leaving his. He drew in a long, uneven breath. "I thought love was punishment. Grace, but you made me realize it's redemption." The words seemed to take something out of him, as if admitting them required every ounce of strength he had left. He moved closer, kneeling beside the couch. For once, he didn't hide behind composure. His eyes were soft, raw, unguarded. Grace reached out instinctively, her fingers brushing his cheek. "You've been carrying that pain for so long," she whispered. He nodded faintly, his voice rough. "I didn't know how to stop." She cupped his face in both hands, tears gathering in her eyes. "You just did?" For a moment, neither moved. The fire popped, sending sparks into the air. Outside, the sky stretched endlessly calm after too many storms. Then Ethan reached for her hand, the same one he'd once held in fear, the same one he'd hurt without meaning to. This time, he lifted it slowly, reverently, and pressed his lips to it. It wasn't a kiss of desire. It was apology, confession, and gratitude all at once. Grace's breath caught. Her tears spilled freely now, silent and unrestrained. He looked up at her, his voice trembling. "You saved me, Grace. I didn't think anyone could, but you did." She smiled through her tears. "You saved yourself. I just reminded you that your heart still works." He let out a shaky laugh, his forehead resting lightly against her knee. For the first time, there was peace in his posture, no tension, no walls, just surrender. Grace ran her fingers through his hair, the way she'd once done in dreams she'd never admitted having. "You're finally alive, Ethan," she whispered. He closed his eyes, his voice barely audible. "Because of you." They stayed like that for a long time, no need for words, no need for explanations. Just two souls, broken and mended in the same breath, breathing together in the quiet. The The fire burned low, the light flickering across their faces like a heartbeat. For the first time in years, Ethan didn't feel the urge to control anything. Not the night, not the moment, not even his fear. He simply sat there beside the woman who had turned his penance into peace and realized that redemption didn't come from perfection. It came from being seen, forgiven, and loved anyway. When he finally whispered, "Thank you," Grace squeezed his hand, smiling through the last of her tears. "Don't thank me," she said softly. "Just keep choosing to stay." And in the glow of that fire, for the first time since his wife's death, Ethan Ward didn't feel haunted anymore. He felt home. The next evening, the penthouse was bathed in the soft glow of the fireplace again, that same warmth that had witnessed their confessions, their arguments, their silences. But tonight, something felt different. The air was lighter, expectant, as if the room itself knew that something long bound was about to be undone. Grace sat curled on the sofa, a book open in her lap, though she hadn't turned a page in 10 minutes. She watched Ethan as he paced near the fireplace, his face unreadable, a single manila envelope clutched tightly in his hand. He had been quiet all evening, distracted, the kind of quiet that felt heavy with purpose. Finally, he stopped pacing and turned to her. His voice was calm, but low and deliberate. "There's something I need to do." Grace tilted her head, curious. "What is it?" He walked closer, the envelope trembling just slightly in his grasp. When he opened it, she recognized it immediately, her breath catching in her chest. The contract, the document that had started everything, the one that had turned her life into an arrangement and her heart into collateral. Ethan looked down at it for a long time, his thumb brushing the signature lines at the bottom. His name, her name, the date that had once felt like a prison sentence. "I remember the day we signed this," he said quietly. "You were scared. I was empty. I told myself it was business, a transaction. Nothing more." He lifted his eyes to meet hers. "But every word in this paper is a lie now." Grace swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. "Ethan?" He took a step closer, the firelight flickering across his face. "You once said I built walls to keep people out. You were right, but you forgot to mention those same walls kept me in." He looked down at the contract again. This he lifted it slightly. The paper trembling in his hand was my last wall. Then, slowly, deliberately, he tore it in half. The sound was soft but final. Grace flinched as the first tear cut through the page, then another, and another, until the contract that had once defined them lay in pieces in his hands. Without hesitation, Ethan crouched by the fire and tossed the fragments into the flames. They curled, blackened, and turned to ash. The ink, their signatures, their rules, their boundaries vanished in orange light. He stayed there for a moment, watching the fire consume it, his jaw tight but his shoulders relaxing with every flicker. It was as though, piece by piece, he was burning the man he used to be. When he stood again, he turned to her, eyes bright, voice low and steady. "You're free, Grace." The words hung in the air like a prayer. He took a step closer, free from this arrangement, free from me, free from everything that started with that paper. "You owe me nothing, not a year, not a child, not even your forgiveness." Grace stared at him, tears glimmering in her eyes. "Why are you saying this?" "Because you deserve choice," he said softly. "For once in your life, I want you to choose what's next, not because you have to, not because the world forced you to, but because it's what you want." He paused, his voice breaking slightly. "If you walk away, I'll understand. I'll let you go. But if you stay..." He stopped, unable to finish. His throat tightened, his composure slipping. Grace rose slowly from the sofa, the blanket falling from her shoulders. The firelight painted her face in soft gold, her eyes wide, luminous, trembling. She crossed the space between them until she stood only inches away. Her voice was quiet, but every word carried weight. "I was free the moment I chose you, Ethan's breath caught. Grace. She shook her head gently, a tear slipping down her cheek. You don't have to give me freedom like it's a gift. You already gave it to me when you stopped hiding, when you let yourself feel. That's when I knew I could stay, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. He looked at her. This woman who had come into his life as a bargain and somehow become his redemption, and for the first time, words failed him completely. Grace reached up, touching his cheek. You burned the contract, she whispered, but the truth was never written on paper. Ethan's chest rose sharply, his heart beat loud in his ears. What truth, he asked hoarsely. Her eyes softened. That we stopped being a deal a long time ago. The silence that followed was a live charge with everything they'd been afraid to say. Then Ethan reached for her hand, slowly, reverently, as if afraid she might vanish. She didn't pull away. His thumb brushed over her knuckles, gentle, trembling, almost worshipful. The firelight danced in her eyes, and he knew he didn't need to say the words aloud. She already knew. Still, when she leaned closer, her breath shaky, he whispered it anyway. I love you? It wasn't grand or dramatic. It was quiet, bare, honest, the kind of truth that only mattered once it had cost everything. Grace's tears fell freely now, but she was smiling through them, that soft, luminous smile that always managed to undo him completely. Without hesitation, she stepped into his arms. The embrace wasn't urgent. It wasn't desperate. It was something deeper. The surrender of two people who had finally stopped fighting the thing that had been growing between them all along. Ethan buried his face against her hair, breathing in the faint scent of lavender and home. Her hands slid up his back, holding him tightly as if anchoring him in place. They stayed like that for a long time, the fire crackling, the city beyond their windows stretching endless and still. No more walls, no more rules, no more pretending, just warmth, just forgiveness, just love. When Grace finally pulled back, she placed a trembling hand against his chest. You feel that, she whispered. He nodded, his heartbeat steady beneath her palm. That's what being alive sounds like, she said. And as the last fragments of their old life turned to ash in the fire, Ethan Ward, the man who once thought love was weakness, held Grace Miller in his arms and finally understood that freedom and love were never opposites. They were the same thing. The storm that arrived the following morning wasn't in the sky, it was walking through the glass doors of Ward Technologies. Samuel Ward had never needed to raise his voice to command a room. His presence was enough. His silver hair, sharp suit, and cold eyes carried the weight of decades of authority, a man who had built an empire on discipline and fear. And that morning, his empire felt betrayed. When the call came from his father's assistant, Mr. Ward Sr., is on his way to the penthouse. Ethan knew exactly why. He didn't warn Grace. He didn't need to. The moment Samuel Ward entered their home, the air itself changed colder, heavier. Grace was sitting in the living room, a book in her hands. She looked up at the sound of the elevator doors. Her expression softened when she saw Ethan, then tensed when she noticed the man beside him. Samuel's gaze swept across the room, the fire still burning low in the hearth, the faint scent of lavender and coffee lingering. His eyes found Grace, then shifted back to his son. So, Samuel began, his voice calm but laced with contempt. It's true. Ethan met his father's eyes evenly. If you mean the contract, yes, it's gone. Samuel's jaw flexed. Do you have any idea what you've done? Yes, Ethan said quietly. For the first time in years. I do. Samuel stepped forward, his tone cutting. You had one obligation to this family, to this company. The board trusted you to secure your legacy, not throw it away because of... He stopped himself, his gaze flicking briefly toward Grace. The unspoken word her hung between them like poison. Grace stood slowly, her chin lifted. Mr. Ward, I understand you're upset, But this isn't your decision. Samuel's eyes hardened. I wasn't speaking to you. Ethan moved before she could reply, his tone sharp. You are now? The older man blinked, surprised. Ethan's voice was calm, but the edge beneath it was unmistakable. Samuel's lip curled faintly. So, that's what this is. Defiance dressed as morality. This is me making my own choices, Ethan said. Something you taught me to do, or so I thought. What I taught you, Samuel snapped, was discipline, responsibility. To put emotion aside for the sake of power. You're throwing away everything I built because of some sentimental fantasy. Ethan's jaw tightened. You call it weakness. I call it being human. His father laughed short, bitter, humorless. Humanity doesn't keep a company alive. Ethan, empathy doesn't win wars. I'm not fighting a war, Ethan said. Not anymore. Then you're already losing. Grace flinched at the harshness in the older man's tone. She had seen Ethan angry before, but she had never seen him wounded like this, the kind of pain that comes only from a father's disapproval. Samuel's voice grew lower, more dangerous. Your mother wanted better for you. She wanted a man who would never compromise. Ethan looked at him, and for a moment, the tension broke into something almost tender, a flicker of grief shared between them. She wanted a man who wouldn't become you, he said quietly. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush the air from the room. Samuel's eyes narrowed. Watch your tone. I've been watching my tone my entire life, Ethan said, biting my tongue, playing the role you designed, the heir, the strategist, the man without feelings. But that's not leadership. That's fear disguised as control. Samuel took a slow breath, his voice sharp as glass. You think this woman will save you from that? Ethan turned slightly toward Grace, who stood motionless by the window, her hands trembling but her gaze steady. She already did. The older man's eyes burned with disbelief. You've lost perspective. Ethan stepped closer, his voice rising now, strong and clear. No, I've found it. You raised me to lead an empire. Father. But she taught me how to be a man. Samuel stared at him, stunned, the words hanging in the air like a declaration. The fire crackled behind them, its warmth in stark contrast to the frost in the older man's eyes. For the first time in his life, Ethan didn't flinch under his father's gaze. He stood tall, shoulders back, every inch the leader Samuel had made him, but finally, one who ruled himself. Samuel's hands clenched at his sides. He looked from Ethan to Grace, and something, pride, regret, fear flickered across his face before it vanished behind that impenetrable mask. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. You're making a mistake. Ethan met his eyes. Maybe, but for once, it'll be my mistake. The older man's mouth twitched the faintest ghost of something that might have been respect, or perhaps just surrender. Without another word, Samuel turned and walked out. The elevator doors closed behind him with a sound that felt almost final. For a long moment, neither Ethan nor Grace spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the city below and the soft crackle of the fire. Ethan stood where his father had left him, his breath shaky, his hands still trembling, but his face calm. Grace crossed the room slowly, her steps quiet. When she reached him, she didn't speak right away. She simply touched his arm, then slid her hand down until their fingers intertwined. He exhaled, closing his eyes as if the contact grounded him. I didn't mean to lose control, he murmured. You didn't lose it, she said softly. You finally used it for yourself. He looked at her, then really looked and saw not the woman from the contract, or the nurse who'd fallen into his world by accident, but the person who had stood beside him through every storm. Sometimes love means standing your ground, she whispered. Ethan nodded, his voice thick. And sometimes it means burning everything down to rebuild it right. Grace smiled faintly. Then maybe this is where we start. He pulled her into his arms, not with urgency, not with fear, but with certainty. For the first time in years, he felt weightless. Outside, the rain that had threatened all morning finally began to fall soft, steady, cleansing. Inside, the fire burned on. Snow fell gently outside the hospital window that night, slow, silent flakes drifting down through the glow of the city lights. The world beyond the glass was hushed, softened by winter. Inside, the air was filled with something sacred, something new. Grace's breathing came in steady waves now, the pain of labor slowly giving way to exhaustion and hope. Ethan sat beside her bed, his hand wrapped tightly around hers, his eyes never leaving her face. He had been there through every contraction, every trembling breath, whispering encouragement in that low, steady voice of his. The man who once measured time in meetings and contracts now counted every second by the rhythm of her heartbeat. And then a cry, sharp, fragile, the first sound of life breaking through the quiet snowstorm outside. Grace let out a sob, part relief, part awe as the doctor lifted the tiny, red-faced baby into her arms. A boy. Ethan froze for a moment. It was as if time had stopped. Grace looked down at the small bundle on her chest, eyes brimming with tears, their son wrapped in a pale blue blanket, fists clenched, lungs strong. The nurse smiled gently. "Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Ward. You have a son." Ethan blinked, the words barely sinking in. A son. He had imagined this moment once back when the idea of family was just an item on a checklist, something to complete for legacy, for image. But this was different. He reached out, his hands trembling as he touched the baby's tiny head. Soft, warm, real. Grace smiled through her tears. "Meet Noah." Ethan's voice broke. "Noah." The name filled the room like a blessing. Grace's fingers brushed his wrist, guiding him closer. "He's waiting for you." Ethan leaned forward, and she carefully placed the baby into his arms. For a man who had built empires and negotiated billion-dollar contracts, holding a 7-pound child felt like the most terrifying, humbling thing he had ever done. Noah's eyes opened just barely, and Ethan swore he saw something ancient there, something that saw straight through him. He whispered, almost to himself, "He's perfect." Grace laughed softly. "Of course he is." Ethan's throat tightened. He looked at her, then back at the tiny life in his arms, and without warning, tears began to fall slow, quiet, unstoppable. He didn't hide them. Not this time. He bent his head and kissed his son's forehead, his voice trembling between breaths. "He's proof that love isn't a deal," he said softly. "It's a miracle." Grace smiled weakly, her eyes glistening. "You finally believe that?" Ethan nodded, unable to speak. He sat there, holding Noah close, feeling the rise and fall of the baby's breath against his chest, the smallest heartbeat, steady and strong. For the first time in his life, Ethan Ward didn't think about control or perfection or legacy. He thought about the sound of Grace's laugh, the warmth of her hand in his, the miracle sleeping in his arms, and he thought, this is enough. Hours passed quietly. The snow outside thickened, blanketing the city in stillness. Inside their hospital room, only the soft hum of machines and the slow, rhythmic breathing of mother and child filled the air. Grace drifted into sleep, her hand still resting against Noah's tiny leg. Ethan sat beside them, the dim light painting soft shadows across his face. He watched them both, the two people who had dismantled his walls without force, who had taught him that love was not a weakness but a lifeline. He whispered, barely above a breath, "You changed everything." Noah stirred slightly, his small face scrunching before settling again. Ethan smiled through his tears. The door opened quietly. Nurse Clara peeked in. "How are we doing?" Dad Ethan looked up, startled by the word dad. He repeated it under his breath, testing it like something fragile. "I'm doing good," he said softly. "Better than I ever thought I could." The nurse smiled knowingly and left, closing the door behind her. Ethan stood, gently placing Noah back into Grace's arms. She stirred, murmuring something half asleep. He leaned down and kissed her temple. "Rest, sweetheart. I've got you both." Then he sat back down, his eyes fixed on the snow outside, flakes swirling under the streetlight, falling over the city that once mirrored his loneliness. Now, it looked peaceful, alive. He remembered his father's words. Empathy doesn't win wars. Maybe not, he thought, but it wins hearts. And for the first time, that was all he wanted to win. He turned back to Grace and Noah, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is our beginning," he said. "No contracts, no conditions, just us." Grace opened her eyes just enough to see him watching her, their son between them. Her lips curved into a tired, tender smile. "Welcome home," she murmured. Ethan nodded slowly, emotion catching in his throat. "Home," he repeated, his hand resting over hers. The snow outside thickened, wrapping the world in white soft, silent, pure. And in that quiet hospital room, where light met shadow and love met redemption, the man who once feared feeling too much finally surrendered to the simple truth that he had been running from all his life. Love wasn't weakness. It was the beginning. The waves of Puget Sound rolled in slow and steady that morning, brushing against the pebbled shore with a sound like breathing. The air smelled of salt and pine, and the coffee the kind of morning that made you believe the world could start over. The Ward family had been living in the small coastal house for nearly a year now, a single-story home with white shutters, creaking floors, and a garden that Grace had filled with wildflowers. It wasn't big, it wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. Ethan stood by the kitchen window, barefoot, wearing an old gray sweater that Grace loved on him. He watched the tide pull back and smiled when he saw two small footprints in the sand, outside Noah's first hesitant steps in the world. The boy was learning to walk, wobbly and determined, his small hands outstretched for balance. Grace crouched beside him on the porch, her laughter floating on the cool air. "Come on, sweetheart. You can do it," she encouraged softly. Noah's giggle echoed, bright and pure. Ethan stepped outside, joining them. The wooden boards creaked under his feet. Grace turned, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "You're missing his big moment." Ethan smiled. "I wouldn't miss it for anything." He crouched beside her, hands ready in case Noah stumbled. The little boy toddled forward one step, two, and then fell right into his father's arms. Ethan laughed, scooping him up, pressing a kiss to his tiny head. "You did it, buddy." Grace reached out, brushing Noah's hair gently. "He's getting brave." Ethan met her eyes. "He gets that from you." She smiled, but there was softness there, the quiet kind that came from peace, not pride. In that moment, she looked exactly like the life they'd built, gentle, honest, free. Inside, the house smelled of cinnamon and paint. Grace had turned the old study into a small art studio. After months of recovery and reflection, she had picked up her brushes again. She painted slowly, deliberately, scenes of the sound, of sunlight through pine trees, of Noah's toys scattered across the floor. Her hands moved with grace and purpose, color blooming under her fingertips. Sometimes Ethan would stand in the doorway, just watching. She'd look up and catch him staring, what she'd ask with that soft grin. And he'd always say the same thing, just memorizing this. Ethan's days were quieter now, too. Ward Technologies still existed, but his life no longer revolved around it. He worked from home most days, his office now overlooking the water instead of the skyline. His colleagues said he'd changed that. He smiled more, that he listened differently. He no longer chased control, he built connection. And every evening, he closed his laptop at 5 sharp, walked into the kitchen, and cooked dinner with Grace. Sometimes Noah would be on the floor, banging a wooden spoon against a pot while they laughed. Sometimes they'd eat on the porch, wrapped in blankets, watching the sun sink behind the sound. It was ordinary, and for Ethan, It was extraordinary. That night, after Noah had fallen asleep and the house had quieted, Ethan and Grace sat outside together. The sky was a quilt of stars, the water calm and dark. A single lantern glowed beside them, its light flickering against their faces. Grace leaned her head against his shoulder. "Do you ever miss the city?" Ethan shook his head slowly. "No. I think I used to miss who I thought I was there, but not anymore." She smiled, tracing circles on his hand with her thumb. "You really changed." He chuckled softly. "You mean I finally grew up?" She tilted her face up to look at him. "No. You finally opened up." He met her gaze, eyes shining in the lantern light. "You did that." Grace's voice was a whisper. "No. Ethan. We did that." They sat in silence for a long time, the waves whispering below, the stars stretching endlessly above them. He once hired her for a year, a contract, a transaction, an arrangement meant to build an heir, not a life, but love doesn't follow contracts. It rewrites them. It starts in the cracks in the silence between words, in the kindness that outlasts anger, in the courage to forgive when it would be easier to walk away. He used to believe control was safety, that love was a liability. But then came a woman who refused to fit into the lines he'd drawn, and a child who taught him that legacy isn't built in boardrooms. It's built in laughter, in the quiet mornings, in the warmth of someone waiting when you come home. Love, he learned, doesn't demand perfection. It demands presence. It doesn't take your freedom. It gives it back to you. Grace turned toward him, resting her hand over his heart. "You know," she said softly, "when I first met you, I thought you were the coldest man I'd ever met." Ethan smiled faintly. "I probably was." And now he looked toward the water, then back at her. "Now," he said, "I just feel lucky." Grace leaned in, kissing him gently. The world around them faded, just the two of them, the sound of waves and the slow rhythm of shared breathing. When they pulled apart, she whispered, "Promise me we'll never forget how we got here." He brushed a thumb along her cheek. "How could I? You're the reason I'm here." She smiled. "We both are." They turned their gaze back to the sound. The tide rolled in, moonlight rippling across its surface, eternal, endless, free. Ethan exhaled slowly, the final line of their story forming in his heart like a vow. "Because real love doesn't cage you," he whispered, "it frees you at its heart." This story reminds us that love is never about control, it's about courage. Ethan and Grace's journey shows that no amount of wealth, status, or structure can protect us from the simple truth to live fully. We must allow ourselves to feel. Many of us, especially as we grow older, learn to build walls to protect our hearts from pain, disappointment, or loss. But the walls that keep out sorrow also keep out joy. Love, in all its imperfect and unpredictable forms, is what makes us human. It heals, it humbles, and it sets us free. Ethan learned that redemption isn't found in power or success. It's found in forgiveness of others and of oneself. Grace proved that compassion is strength, and that real freedom comes not from running away, but from choosing to stay. So, if life has hardened you, remember this. It's never too late to open your heart again, because love doesn't weaken us. It teaches us how to begin again and again. Thank you so much for joining us on this heartfelt journey of Ethan and Grace, a story of love, loss, and the quiet strength it takes to begin again. If this story touched your heart, made you reflect, or simply reminded you of the beauty of second chances, please take a moment to show your support. Leave us a comment, tell us what part moved you the most. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel, Shining Stories, where every week we bring you powerful tales of hope, healing, and the kind of love that changes lives. Because stories like this one deserve to be heard, and hearts like yours keep them alive.